The next stitch that we're going to learn is the fill stitch. Now the fill stitch is really similar to the satin stitch in that you use it to cover an area. The difference is the satin stitch, you want all of your stitches uniform across that area that you're filling, but the fill stitch, you stagger your stitches so that it's a little bit denser, it can add texture and a different look to your project. So I'm going to show you right here how you would create a fill stitch in the same area so you can compare it to a satin stitch. So instead of going all the way across the same area, I'm going to break up that stitch, and it just depends on the texture that you're looking to create, how much you want to stagger your stitches, how many different stitches you want to add in each row. It just depends on the look that you're going for. I'm just going to break each of these into 2 different stitches, but I'm going to stagger where I place the break in between those stitches, or how long and short the stitches are, especially next to each other. I'm going to be deliberate in putting my stitches in places where they're not right next to each other. The breaks aren't uniform across the area that I'm creating. And this is how you would do a fill stitch if you're going across an area just the way you're doing a satin stitch. I'm going to show you the stitch, how it looks when you're creating a vertical stitch. This is what we're going to be doing in our project, is going up and down to create the letters. So I'm going to create a 1 row. This looks a lot like a back stitch because it is when you create your first row. And then the second row, after you filled in your area, you're going to come, but you're going to make this stitch shorter so that the break, again, isn't lining up straight across. This is going to create a little bit more texture, and also you'll see as we get a few more of these stitches in that it sort of creates kind of a chain or a rope-like effect when they're right next to each other. And this, when you're doing it on your actual stitching, these threads will be next to each other. But you can see how it just breaks it up, how it's not one flat thing across, or it doesn't look choppy. It sort of blends those pieces together. Now, if you're doing a curve and you're going, I'm going to angle this one here. We'll make, I don't even know what letter this will be because I'm stitching upside down. We're going to add a little curve to the bottom. We're going to pretend it's an L. So if I wanted this to go from a thick line to a thin line, I would come back up into here. This is just going to give me a better angle to come into this long stitch here. And then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to actually bury it in the middle of that stitch. And that way, once I pull that through, it'll look like I'm going from 1 stitch into 2 stitches. Now on our sampler, we're going to use a fill stitch just to stitch the letters. So we're not filling a huge area, but if we stagger our stitches, you can see that it creates a little bit more texture rather than just doing 2 rows of back stitching right next to one another. And that's why I called this a fill stitch instead of just 2 rows of back stitching. So I wanted to show you just a couple of things. It is in essence just a back stitch. So we're going to start here on this thin line and we're going to do 1 row of back stitching. And I'm just going to come up and down, and again I'm going to try to get my stitches to adjust to the curve of this letter. And I'm going to stitch towards the outside of this line because as it gets thick, I'm approaching the area where I'm going to add a second line of stitching. So on these letters, everywhere there's a skinny line, like on these O's, you can see the skinny line will be 1 row of stitching and the thick line will be 2 rows of stitching. So I'm going to follow again on the outside of the curve of my H here, and I'm just going to do a couple more stitches so I can show you how to blend back in the stitch on a curve like this where you're going from 1 strand into 2. So that's as much as I'm going to do down that straightaway. So my next row of stitches, because I'm staggering, I'm going to start this second row of stitches halfway, and this is going to be hard to see on this thread, but it's halfway between that last stitch that I just did. And it's kind of easier to do the second row because you already have your first row dictating the length of your stitches. I just divide them in half, and the next stitch ends halfway in between the stitch right next to it. And that gives you that cool rope-like look and that staggered look to your stitch. So now I'm going to show you what I would do, because I want to end the second row and kind of bury it inside this stitch. So instead of bringing my stitch up in the middle, I'm going to bring my stitch up right where the last one ended, so that I can get a good shot. And what I'm going to do is just bury this stitch halfway in the middle and underneath that stitch, so that my stitch looks like it just sort of disappears under there. So now I have a thin line going into a thick line. And I'll do that everywhere I have one strand going into two strands. So I'll do the one strand here, the whole outside of this E, and then I'll come back and do the second row, but I'll bury the end in here, and I'll bury the other end of the stitching in here, so that I have just a partial row of two, but it looks like my stitches just sort of expanded and split into two. So that's how you do a fill stitch. It's a super fun way to add texture to an area, or even a thin area like these letters. And next, we're moving on to French knots.